Good. Okay. So thank you again for inviting me. What I'm going to tell you about today is a trip that I did with the Orchid Conservation Alliance to a river that's a tributary of the Amazon called the Rio Negro. This is a tour that, until the pandemic, the Orchid Conservation Alliance usually runs every year. Sometimes we've had two trips per year because it's such a popular tour. And let me just jump right into it. It's going to be more than orchids, though, because I really want to give you a flavor of, just all the wonderful things that you could see on a trip like this. So here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'll give you an introduction to the Orchid Conservation Alliance. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about it and what we do. And then tell you a little bit about the Amazon and its seasonal flooding. And then more about the Rio Negro and a short geography lesson just to orient you towards where the Rio Negro is and how it pertains to the Amazon as a whole. And then launch into our typical daily excursion and some of the highlights of the trip. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about Margaret Mee, and I'm sure many of you have heard of her, and hopefully you've seen her paintings, which are many of which are at Kew somewhere. I haven't seen them at Kew, but supposedly they're there, and I would certainly love to see them. So that will be towards the end of the talk. Okay, the Orchid Conservation Alliance is a grassroots organization. We have members all over the world, and our basic mission is to create and support orchid reserves, that is, to preserve the habitat, so nature's most amazing flora can continue to survive in the wild. And we've created reserves mostly in South America, and here's just a map of most of them. They're in Colombia and Ecuador, and we have a couple of locations in Brazil as well. And we work with local organizations and foundations and universities and so forth to basically purchase the land. The Orchid Conservation Alliance does not own the land, the local foundations do, to get permanent conservation permits and so forth to basically forever purchase the land. And we also have put a great deal of effort into identifying the most diverse and orchid-rich habitats as possible, and these are the ones that we focused on preserving. Some of our best known ones are the Dracula Reserve, which is on the border of Ecuador and Colombia here. This is basically the center of diversity for the genus Dracula and is actually an amazing place. Another one that's fairly recent is the Salvo Montes Reserve, which has been organized in cooperation with some Colombian orchid societies and local people. And this one is in the process of continuing to expand, and it also preserves some really amazing forests. And this just gives you an idea of what we've accomplished since we were formed in 2006, preserving basically hundreds of acres of forest permanently. And by partnering with other organizations such as the Rainforest Trust and so forth, we've now preserved, as you can see here, well over 25,000 acres of primary orchid-rich habitats. And here's just, if you go visit our website, you can read about the reserves. They're full of photographs taken from the reserve and more information about how they're administered and our current activities. And then we also have a page that explains our partners and how we work with them. Anyway, these are our partners who we work with. And this is how we raise funds for the Orchid Conservation Alliance. We have memberships. You can donate directly to the organization. Quite a few of our members use Amazon, and they have this thing called Smile, which donates 1% of the revenue to the OCA. We do have booths at shows, mostly in the US. I don't think we've ever done an international show, but we sell t-shirts and bags and things like that at shows. And one of our principal fundraisers are Orchids in the Wild trips. And we've been on many, many trips. We usually do 2 or 3 a year. We go to exotic places like New Guinea and Madagascar, Ecuador, Colombia, Thailand, Brazil, etc. And we take groups of anywhere from 8 to about 14 people on our tours. And it's a wonderful way to experience how orchids actually grow in the wild, to learn more about the local forests and the challenges of preserving them, to learn about the culture of the country that we visit, and just make a lot of new friends and have a good time. So the Orchids in the Wild Rio Negro, this is just a picture taken from the website just to give you an impression of the overall trip. And if you want to learn more about it, you can visit our website and go to the Rio Negro page and have fun looking at the photographs. So basically, let's get down to the talk now. What I'm going to talk about are the flooded forests of the Amazon. And the Amazon changes in levels up to 40 plus feet every year, with the flooding beginning to start in January and reaching its peak around June to very early July. And where we visited, the waters were basically 40 feet above where they were 6 months prior to that. So basically the boat we're on, which is shown here, is floating at the tree line. And our daily schedule was basically to have quick coffee and snacks in the morning, to jump into our boats and go out and explore the forest for 3 or so hours, come back for breakfast, after which we'd have a break time where everyone could read. You know, there was a library on the boat. You could, go read orchid books and try to identify what you saw, watch birds, work on your photos. And then we always had a group of people who like to draw and paint. And so there would be a group of them which would be up sketching and painting on the upper floor of the boat. After that, we would have lunch and then more break time. Often we would go swimming in the Amazon during this time, which was great fun. And then in the late afternoon, we'd go on an evening trip, which was one of the most spectacular parts about the journey, is spending 4 hours, 3.5 hours on a small boat, floating around in the forest as the sun went down. And it was just spectacular sunsets. After returning, we'd have dinner and people would then read, go to the bar. Some nights we had a movie because there was a VCR on the boat. But it was just, a very, very relaxing trip. And the flooded forest is, as I mentioned, flooded annually. And basically we fly into Manaus, and this is the Rio Negro, where we visited, shown here. And this is the other part of the Amazon. And as you can see, the waters of the Rio Negro, true to its name, are what are known as a Blackwater forest or Blackwater River or Negapo. And the color of the water is due to these dissolved organic tannins, and it creates a very acidic environment, very different from the other parts of the Amazon. And if you look at the place where the waters meet from a satellite, you can see the Rio Negro here flowing past the city of Manaus. And then here's the other part of the Amazon coming in, and it's full of lots of dirt and silt and so forth. And as you can see, the two waters really don't mix. And this goes on for miles and miles and miles before they actually merge and come together. And you can go on the boat and see where the waters come together. So this is just taken from the edge of the boat, and you can see the brown water of the silt-rich Amazon meeting the waters of the Rio Negro. And because of differences in temperature, salt content, and other features, these waters don't mix for many, many miles. Now, there's some interesting facts about Blackwater rivers that make this a particularly nice region to visit. First of all, although the water looks black, it's very, very clear. It's almost sterile with a very acidic pH, with minimal parasites and bacteria, and it's thought to be some of the cleanest water in the world. This acidic environment also inhibits insect larvae. And I must say, on the entire trip, we did not see a single mosquito. And that's been the experience of 4 or 5 years of people traveling on these trips on the Rio Negro. They don't see mosquitoes and little to no other biting insects. which makes it a very pleasant tour as opposed to other regions of the Amazon, which can be plagued with mosquitoes and other biting insects. The water here also has a very low oxygen content. And as a consequence, some of the very large fish, such as the piraku, are air breathers. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute, but they have vestigial gills. So there are a number of advantages of exploring a flooded forest, especially for older people who very often have trouble with some of our tours because they do involve a fair amount of hiking. Here, there is no hiking. It's great. You just float up to the trees and the orchids are at eye level. Every day we're traveling to a different region of the river, and although it looks the same from the air, miraculously the orchids and vegetation and other things on the river are quite different from one area to another. And it's an incredibly peaceful vacation. No TV, no internet, no cell phones, and no stresses from the outside world. So it's basically an opportunity for a 7 to 10 day withdrawal from everything that we stress with on a daily basis. The food on the trip is excellent. We have fresh caught fish and local fruits and vegetables. And of course, the stunning sunrises and sunsets. And then the delightful ambience on the boat itself. Now, where did we go? Well, I'm not quite sure, because when you look at a picture of the Rio Negro from the air, it looks like this. It's just full of all of these channels, small lakes, and we floated around in the midst of all of this, and that's basically what we were exploring. All the green there represents the treetops, and the black are pools of water. You can see there's some major channels of the river here, but then all these little small lakes and so forth interspersed in amongst these so-called islands. And I'm sure when the water recedes 40 feet, these are basically islands in the river itself. Here's our boat. It's called the SS Otter. It has about 17 staterooms and then various public areas, a bar, a nice group room, a library, as I mentioned, with quite a few orchid books in it, tables, places for people to paint, an upper deck for laundry, and then off the back would float several canoes that we would use to go out and explore the forest. So let's go exploring. Our first morning, we're out on the canoes, and this is basically what it looks like. It's kind of hard to see, but the water is right here. So the reflection of the water makes it look like you're in this a forest that goes up and down because it reflects on the water, and it's just absolutely peaceful and gorgeous. And you basically float through this and you look for orchids and other interesting plants as you go. One of the first ones that we saw, and we saw many, many plants of this, was this beautiful Prosthetic Fragrance. We probably saw several dozen plants of it on the trip. And one of the things I just want to emphasize up front is that although we didn't see, hundreds of different types of orchids in bloom, we saw quite a few not in bloom, and then we would find the same orchids in different locations and so forth multiple times. So although the diversity wasn't really high, and that's well known for lower elevation rainforests, we did see a tremendous abundance of orchids on the tour. And so, as I mentioned, this Prosthecia was one of the many that we saw. And this was basically right at eye level. So the boat floated right up to the Prosthecia, and I'm in the boat about 4 feet away from the flower and could get this wonderful picture of it. We also saw probably several dozen specimens of this Cibralia Cecilus. This is obviously an epiphyte, and it's growing basically in the crooks of trees. And in some areas, every single plant was in bloom simultaneously. In other areas, some of the blooms were finished and we just saw a few. But when we did find it, we would usually find lots of flowers of it, great examples. And then here on the right is a photograph of a Brassia. Not sure exactly what species it is, but possibly Cochleata. And again, just another image of what it was like to float through the forest. Here's a few more of the orchids that we saw. There were lots of this Brassivola. It was quite numerous numbers of plants. Unfortunately, none of them were in bloom, so I can't really give you an ID on which species it was, but we did see an abundance of these. And here's another one of the Cibralias. This is an unidentified epidendrum. Again, we saw this numerous times. And just to give you an idea of the forest, I'm going to take you on a little cruise here, just to give you an idea of what it's like to travel through the forest. And that's basically what we would do, is we would travel through the forest on these open water areas. Then once we got into the open areas between the trees, we'd float in those and go look for orchids. So here's a few more. We saw an abundance of bromeliads, some very spectacular ones. I am not a bromeliad expert, but I think some of these are tillandsias and maybe apneas. And then lots of different flowering trees. There are quite a few different species of clusia that grow in this region, as well as a lot of other beautiful flowering trees. And then great specimens of philodendron winding their way through the forests. Of course, whenever we saw an orchid, everybody would get really, really excited. So here we are finding Epiderm Nocturnum. This is one of the species that we saw dozens of different specimens of, and a close-up on the right, but nonetheless, really great to see. Here's another Prosthechia. This one is Fostechia Vespa. Again, we saw quite a few plants of this one. And then one of the most common plants that we saw on the whole trip were these Polystachia Concreta, and they would very often cover the trunks of the trees as we wound our way through the forest. It didn't really have a terribly interesting flower. It was basically a little yellow flower at the end of these growths, but it was quite abundant. And one of the prettiest things to see was just this wonderful pink sprinkling of flower petals on the water. Every time you drove under one of those pink trees that were in flower, underneath it would be this wonderful scenery. Rodolphiella, we saw quite a few plants of it. Unfortunately, none of them in bloom, but here's one that we were clearly able to identify based on its bulb morphology. Another specimen of Prosthechia Vespa. And then one of the more common genera that was represented on the trip were various catasetums, and we were lucky to see this one in bloom. I don't have an ID on it. It kind of looks like Fimbriatum, but I don't think that's what it is. And again, here's another specimen of this beautiful Cibralia Cecilus. This Orleanza amazonica, which is kind of a homely little flower, but it was really abundant, and it grew on sort of bare open trees out in the open spaces. And we saw lots of different plants of that on the trip. This is the female flowers of one of the catasetums that was just glimpsed poking behind some branches. We actually couldn't see the parent plant itself, although I think this might be one of the bulbs of it. Well, not only did we see orchids, but we saw an amazing variety of birds on the tour. We saw flocks of these blue and yellow macaws, and they're just shown here, and lots of these white-throated toucans. And this is a painting that we saw on one of the buildings in the towns that we visited, showcasing the macaws and the toucan. And we saw them just like in the painting. So I loved this painting and how well it represented what we actually saw. And this is a movie of the macaws settling down in the evening. And you can see them here. We have quite a flock of them. There's probably 8 or 10 birds in this one tree. And they're just settling down for the night. And another bird that was fairly common were Oropindalas, and they build these incredible hanging nests, and we saw evidence of them many, many different places on the trip. And so these are the hanging nests of the Oropindala. And here's one of the beautiful pictures of the sunset on the flooded forest. And we were treated to this every single night, slightly different views depending on where we were, but this just gives you an idea. And let's just take a little boat tour through the flooded forest, just to give you an idea of the the beauty and the peace of what we could see at sunset. There's one of the other boats. We had 2 of them, so we'd each get into one of 2 boats every night. Okay, so more orchids. This is the only one of this species that we saw, and we basically floated up to this Maxillaria Camaridii. Cameridium was briefly a genus in and of itself, and I believe this was the type species for it. We saw quite a few Maxillarias. I don't have IDs on many of them, but here's another one where we got a good view of the flower. And this particular one, the flower was about 3 inches across. Scuticarias, we saw probably several dozen plants of this, and it's characterized by these long pencil-like leaves, and then usually the flowers are pretty chewed up when we saw them, but look at the roots on this. They go all over the branches of the tree, and it was quite distinctive to see those. Here's another one shown over here. Then this very large plant, I think it's another one of the Prosthetic Vespas. Oh no, this is the Prosthetic Vespa, and I'm not sure I was able to ID this one. We also saw quite a few very large plants in the trees that were too high up to really get a good ID on. But Peter Tobias, who's the president of the OCA and has been on this trip many, many times, tells us that usually when they've gone on this trip, they see lots of Schomburgkia in bloom. And it's quite possible that some of the big, large clumps were the Schomburgkia that had either finished or not started to bloom on this particular trip. We saw this beautiful little specimen of Epiderm Selectorianum, a very nice little miniature. This was growing on a tree trunk, literally about 1 foot above the water level. And of course, every time we'd see an orchid, everybody would get excited, pull out their cameras, and be taking pictures of it. So it's just, again, how excited everybody got when they saw the orchids. And here's an incredible specimen of the Ariopsis Septum and a close-up of the flowers here. I think the most common flower that we saw on the whole tour was this spectacular Gallandra Devoniana. You don't see these very often in culture, but it was definitely one of the more common orchids that we saw on the trip. And we saw various color forms of it. Here's an albinistic form of it. And it was basically right at the water level, growing on a variety of different substrates. Sometimes dead trees, sometimes on palm trees, but almost every time right, at eye level, and just an amazing flower. And here's just a few more shots of different flowers that we saw. This fellow here in this picture is Gilberto Castro, and I'll tell you more about him in a minute, but he's the captain of our boat. And on several occasions, we saw large clumps of Cattleya violacea. These were spotted, however, on the big boat because these tended to grow very high up in the trees, and you could only spot them and photograph them from the 3rd or 4th story of the otter. I don't know if it's because they are protected from being collected at that height, and that's why we saw them there, or if that's the only area in which they grow, but they definitely were spectacular plants. And here we are again, just floating through the water. And I wanted to show this Jara palm, which is in the middle of the picture here. It was incredibly common and a host for many different orchids. So you would find catasetums in there, you would find the Gallandra in there, some of the Maxillarias and so forth. So whenever we spotted one of these, we would float up to it and give it a good look to see what we could find growing in it. We saw many, many spectacular bromeliads. And as I mentioned, I'm no bromeliad expert, but they were gorgeous. So here's, I think it's an acmea, and here's a few more, and a few more, just to give you an idea of the incredible diversity of bromeliads that you could see in just a few hours. Now, life along the Amazon is interesting. Here's a tiny village, and there was many of these that we passed on the way. Now, bear in mind that the water is at its high level. So during half of the year, what we're looking at is 40 to 60 feet from the water line. And so whatever gets built close to the water line is up on stilts due to the annual flooding. And here's the school, and I'll tell you more about how the children get to school in a minute. But as we floated along, we could see many other animals. Here's a green iguana. We saw quite a few of these, and some of them were quite large, easily 3 or 4 feet long, including their tails, which tended to be very long. We saw a number of other lizards. This is a little whiptail lizard, and this cute little Leolamus. I think it's related to iguanas. And I love this one. This is a praying mantis that was in one of the trees that the Gallandra was growing in. And then, of course, we saw monkeys. So one that we didn't see too many of were the white-fronted Capuchins. And these guys are quite the characters.
He's showing his teeth.
That's why I don't want him to hold the banana.
I think they're guarding their territory right now. See how they're shaking the tree branch? They're mad.
So not only did we see the Capuchins, but we saw a few of these pale three-toed sloths. They did not move. They just basically sat there as we floated by. And then we saw several troops of common squirrel monkeys. And these guys were incredibly tame. So as you got close to them on the boat, they just decided to come aboard. And of course, we brought bananas with us to feed them. So here they are. Oops, drop the camera. They were fearless. And this is how the kids get to school. They go by boat on these little boats that take them to school or back every day. We visited a little farm that harvests tapioca and processes it. So here's the roots of the tapioca and the machinery that you use to process it. And then I think this may also be manioc, and they get this powdered stuff that they use for a starch in their diet. Here's a typical house along the river. It's kind of in sad shape. You can see that it's up on stilts and you float up to it on your canoe because the river is basically the highway in this region. We visited a small town called Parazinho. It was actually the scene of a raunchy Brazilian sitcom, as I understood. There was a big sign as you got off the boat to come in here and look at it. And living up to its name was this rather raunchy statue in front of the little craft shop. But the craft shop, they were making beads out of different seeds and so forth, and selling masks and necklaces and so forth in this little shop. One of the other things you do on the Amazon is you feed the pink dolphins. So they would follow the boat for the entire trip. But there was one area where there was basically a floating island in the middle of the river, man-made island. And you could stand on the dock here and feed the dolphins, or you could actually get in the water with them and feed them as well, which was kind of fun to do. The other thing we did was to feed the pirarucu. These are one of the largest fish in the world. They're up to 10 feet long. And we actually had one for dinner one night, and they were absolutely delicious. But at this little dock, they tied a fish on the end of a string and you held it over the water, and the fish would come up and basically grab that, and you could see them all in there. They now farm these pirarucus because they're a very good source of protein and so forth for the local people. But they were enormous fish. These were all just little babies. So this is one of the large fish that is a partial air breather because of the low oxygen content of the water. They come up to the surface and breathe air. Sadly, the pandemic has had a really adverse effect on this region. As you know, Manaus was ravaged by the COVID-19. And the only way these people can get to a hospital is on these little boats that go back and forth. They're incredibly crowded. And of course, if one person gets on with COVID, everybody does. And many of the people living in these villages were indigenous people or half indigenous, and they've had an incredible death rate in these areas. So I really don't know how this area looks now, but I'm sure it's really been devastated by the pandemic. Now, the reason I mentioned Margaret Mead is that on Gilberto's boat, there were a number of Margaret Mead paintings, which was curious. And when I asked him further about it, it turns out that on Margaret Mead's last trips to the Rio Negro in 1986 and 88, I believe, she actually commissioned Gilberto to be her boatman. So he was the person who drove the boat and helped her find different things to paint in the Rio Negro. And this is her painting of the Cattleya violacea. And this is one of the bromeliads. And if you haven't seen this book, I strongly advise it. It's wonderful reading. And interestingly, when Margaret was doing her last trip, which was to paint the Amazon moonflower, which blooms once a year for a single night, it opens, gets pollinated hopefully, and closes. This was her very last trip to the Amazon before she was tragically killed in a car accident. Here's a photograph of her smelling the moonflower and her painting of it. And this is the very plant that she drew and photographed. So since Gilberto had taken her to it, he knew exactly where it was, and he took us back to see this very plant. And while she was painting on her last trip and her second to last trip, she stayed at this little cottage that Gilberto has along the river. So this is his little house that Margaret Mead stayed in. Where we're standing over here is where they had her birthday party. And then there's this little plaque here of for Margaret Mead and her last birthday party that was held right here. And on this forest, we had this wonderful picnic that Gilberto, shown here again, and his crew put on for us with lots of locally caught fish and vegetables and various meats and so forth. And so that was a real treat to have that and learn more about Margaret Mead. Well, it turns out that Gilberto now takes 2 to 3 tours a year of botanical artists on the Amazon, mostly from Brazil. Groups from the universities there come and they float around on his boat for a week and they gather flowers from the forest and they paint them. And he's maintained this tradition for many years, and the purchase of his SS Otter really allows him to do so. And our first trip that the OCA did with Gilberto was actually a botanical artist tour where we had several people who were botanical artists that went on the trip, and a few of us photographers who wanted to photograph things. And it was such a popular trip that we've done it almost every year since. So I hope you enjoyed the Cibralias, Gallandras, the birds, the wonderful flooded forests, and the spectacular views that you had on a daily basis. And you'll come with us on an Orchid in the Wild tour with the Orchid Conservation Alliance. If you want to learn more about us, here's our website. And time out for a little commercial that Kevin mentioned. Our most recent book, A Compendium of Miniature Orchid Species, it's a 4-volume series, 2nd edition, is now published. And as Kevin said, it's on its way from India to the UK, where it will be then mailed out to everyone. And if you want to learn more about the books, here's the website. Basically just Google Redfern Natural History and you'll be able to find the page. So I'd just like to acknowledge Gilberto Castro and his crew, Peter Tobias, who organized the tour, our tour participants that went on the trip with us. And I might mention Tom and Neil Biggert are potters and artists, and they did a great deal of sketching and painting on the trip. Gary Ann is married to a professor of photography, and he was also on the trip. Can't see his name here. Yeah, Carlos Richardson. And then John Daly was our bird man. He had a great big lens and took pictures of all the birds. And the rest of the group were basically orchid nuts, except for Kathy McCord, who's Tobias's wife, and she is also an artist. So she did many watercolors on the trip. And then I'd just like to thank my co-author, Ron Parsons, who helped me identify many of the plants and birds, et cetera, that I saw on the trip. So with that, I'll quit and I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Mary, thank you so much for the fantastic talk. It's very fascinating. I'm just going to try and unmute everyone so they would be able to ask you a question in virtual person. So if you have a question, do feel free to unmute yourself and ask to Mary.
Okay, I've put in a question in the chat already, 2 questions actually. One, what's the altitude and climate of the Rio Negro? Is it sort of equatorial lowland or is it quite high up?
Oh, no, it's, I don't know, very few feet above sea level.
Okay, so it's pretty hot.
It was warm. It was probably 90 degrees, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I mean, coming from California, for me, one of the greatest treats was you could take 6 showers a day if you wanted to, because there was an unlimited amount of water. And basically, when it got hot in the afternoon, we were swimming in the Amazon. And it's so warm there that it was like swimming in a bathtub, kind of. It was very warm. And we would float around on these little floaty things, I'm not sure what they're called, and just basically have fun out in the water. As long as you're way out in the middle and not towards the edges, there's no piranhas or anything really to worry about. But we didn't get far from the boats.
Brilliant. The other part of my question was, is this new compendium of miniature species in 4 volumes the same as the 2 volumes set I already have?
Well, it's the second edition of the 2 volumes we already have. It has 500 new species added to it, totally updated taxonomy, and over 3,500 new photographs. So it's
right.
not.
Okay. So,
If you want to get it and don't want to spend the money, sell your old one, which is still $800 a volume, and you can buy all 4 of these for the equivalent of 199 pounds and have twice as much stuff.
okay. I don't think they cost quite that much in Britain, actually, but yeah, a great book, though. Pleased to have them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question?
Mary, hi. I'm obviously, you know, I'm a swimmer, and you mentioned swimming in the Rio Negro. With the dolphins, how and the pH of the water being really quite acidic. Sorry, this is not an orchid related question, everyone, but how do you feel after getting out of that water? I mean, it's clearly quite acidic. Is it, you know, you have to have a shower straight away, or?
Well, the shower is river water too.
Oh damn, yeah. Oh yeah. True.
It didn't bother your skin at all. It made your skin feel very soft. So I didn't really notice anything about it. You know, the first couple of times we got in the water, I was a little nervous about piranhas, but we didn't see anything.
Yeah.
So it was very enjoyable. I think the piranhas hang out in the trees where the animals fall out of the trees. And actually, I suspect in the Rio Negro, because of the pH of the water and et cetera, there are not very many piranhas there. We really didn't see any evidence of them.
Okay. Well, in that case, sign me up.
Fantastic. Beth Otway, she's our admin of Facebook. She's actually asking, is there a coupon or voucher for the new book for the Osgb members?
No, we don't have a coupon, but if you buy 10 or more copies, I don't know how much this will be an advantage because you're in the UK, but the shipping of the book to the US is obviously going to be quite expensive. We're thinking it'll probably be $60 to $70 a set. And so what we'd offer to US and any other country, if your Orchid Society buys 10 or more copies, we will send all the books to one address and not charge anything for the shipping costs. And then your Orchid Society can distribute the book to its members however works best for you. So the San Francisco Orchid Society, for example, bought about 20 copies, which shall be delivered here, and then the members will pick them up at the president's house, which is still a big savings since it's almost a quarter of the cost of the book is the shipping cost.
Absolutely. We have organized something similar in the past. So yeah, it's definitely something for our librarian, Irene Campbell. She's on the line, so she might consider organizing something like that or asking members who are interested. Maybe we can get the numbers together.
Okay, I will send you the information. I think there's a code that you use to order with. So I'll just check with the publisher and I'll get back to you on exactly how you do that. Okay.
Well, can I also ask, are these books the same physical format as the first edition, or are they smaller size?
They're a little bit smaller because one of the things we realized was that the book was so big, it was difficult to look at. And a lot of people want to spend hours looking at it. So now the page size is a sort of a typical typewriter page, 8.5 by 11 inches.
Okay. For me, it was actually, they're just so heavy to pick up. It's the weight.
Exactly.
Instead of...
So they're still heavy, but not as heavy as the other ones.
Okay.
I just carried a box because I got an airmail version of them sent to me 2 days ago. And I just carried 4 boxes or 2 boxes, two volumes in each box up my stairs into my house. And they're not light. I'm sure the mailmen are going to complain about carrying the boxes. But anyway, they're still heavy, but not as heavy as the first version. We had no idea when we did it that the books were going to turn out to be so large or so heavy. It's hard to predict when you're writing something and you don't really get a good feel for it until you have the physical copy in your hand and you're going like, oh my God. This really is the big book on little orchids. So yeah.
Still quite big, still heavy, just a bit smaller. Any other questions?
Yes, there's Richard Hasek here. I just wondered if there was any evidence yet or any information, looking at all your photographs, and I was wondering about global warming and how it would affect the area. Obviously, they've got flooding, so wonder if you had any information with regards to that subject.
Well, as you probably know, the Brazilian rainforest, the Amazon rainforest, is being destroyed at an incredible rate. I just reread Margaret Mead's book last week. And in 1988, she was complaining about the clearing of the forests and destruction and so forth. And all you need to do is look at Google Earth and you can just see massive pieces of the Amazon have been totally clear cut, turned into farms, etc. What has that done? Well, in some regions, such as the South, they're in a complete drought. So the Paraná River, which is one of the other big rivers in South America, is way down. The whole area is experiencing a terrible drought. And part of it is because of the destruction of the forests, which are a big reserve for all of the water and so forth. So those parts of South America are really suffering. And the warming effect that you see in the Brazilian, in the Rio Negro, I suspect it will impact the clarity of the water eventually, which will have a major impact on everything there. Right now, if it floods a little bit more, a little bit less every year, the environment is basically adapted to that. And the temperature is pretty much warm all year round. So I'm not sure that warming of temperatures per se in that region will have a devastating effect, but it definitely will have an effect on the water and the way the whole ecosystem functions.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Paul? Paul, you're on mute.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I have a copy of your Mastervalia book, obviously. I wonder, a lot of the photographs in this book are plants that have been grown by Anna Chai.
Yes.
Are you in contact with her? If you are, could you ask her to go on Facebook so we can see more of her plants? Because they're staggeringly well grown.
She's I know her quite well. She lives about a half a mile from my house. Unfortunately, about probably 10 years ago now, she developed a type of lung cancer and completely downsized her collection because it was just too much for her to keep up. She just couldn't. She had, I don't know, 3 greenhouses and all of this stuff, and she no longer has any greenhouses. She grows a few masdevallias outside. I don't think she's a Facebook kind of person. She does have email. There are quite a few people here in the Bay Area, though, that are spectacular growers of masdevallias. John Leathers being one of them. He has probably the largest collection, I think, in maybe not in the world, but definitely in the US. He has almost every single species of masdevallia in his collection, and his greenhouse is just a joy to behold. And then Tom Perliti, who owned Golden Gate Nursery. He's now given up on the nursery, but he still grows quite a few masdevallias, and he's actually got into Dendrobium cuthbertsonii now. But we have a lot of people here in the Bay Area who grow masdevallias exceedingly well. We just have the right climate. I mean, the San Francisco climate is not that different from a cloud forest in Ecuador most of the year. We don't get heat, and we get clouds and fog and cool weather. And, you know, in San Francisco itself, many people grow their masdevallias outdoors year round.
Okay, well, would you thank her on my behalf just for the fantastic plants that you photographed and put in the book?